Good morning. My name is Stefan Gunnarsson and I'm the chairman of the board of admitting associate professors, the docenten. And welcome to this docent lecture by Else Verbeek. And before I give the word to Else, I would like to introduce also that we have a topic expert, subject expert, which is Professor Harry Blockhouse. And we have a pedagogical expert, which is Henrik Wiberg. So Else will present for 30-35 minutes, and then there will be questions from the experts, and it will also be open for the audience in the room. Else has applied for becoming an associate professor in the topic animal science, and the special topic is animal welfare. And she's from the Department of Animal Environment and Health. Her title is Exploring the Hidden Mental and Emotional Lives of Animals. You're welcome, Else.
Thank you, Stefan. Yes, okay, so welcome to this talk about emotions and mental states in animals. So I will start with a very brief overview about what I'm going to talk about today. So we will start discussing the challenge of understanding animals and why this is important if we want to ensure welfare. And then I will explain how understanding affective states helps us to improve animals. And in the end, I will have a brief discussion about the future of animal affective state research. So I will start with a few questions for you first. If you look at a picture, this picture here of this sheep, how do you think this animal feels? And what do you think, does it have good welfare or not? You can answer me or you can just think for yourself. And then we have another picture here. So what do you think about these animals here? And what about their welfare? How do these animals feel? And the final one here, these sheep, how do they feel? What about their welfare? And now I want you to reflect on what you've just been thinking and how you've been judging the welfare and the emotions of these animals. So what assumptions did you make to make these judgments? Did you look at the environment that the animal is kept in? Did you look if it was a natural environment or perhaps a domesticated environment? Did you perhaps look at the temperature? Were the animals in the cold or were they warm? Did you look if they were in a group or if they were alone? Or did you perhaps look at the animal itself? Did you look at its body language, its facial expressions, whether they were shorn or not? And the thing is, there's a lot of ways we can judge the welfare of the animal. And it can be very challenging to get a right idea of what the animal is perceiving and what the animal is feeling, how good a welfare is. And the problem is that animals have their own motivations. Animals have their own perceptions and their own needs. And they may be very different from ours. Animals, for example, have very different senses. We people are very visual. So we perceive the world through our eyes. And we pick up very quickly visual cues. And this is what we respond to. And this is what determines how we feel. But for example, we take a dog. Dogs are very, they use their noses a lot and their ears. So they pick up very different signals from the environment. And this influences how they perceive what is happening around them. And in the end, this influences how they feel. So if we look at animals from our perspective, we run the risk of judging welfare based on our values, our perceptions, and our own beliefs and emotions. And when we do that, we risk not really understanding what the animal actually needs, and this compromises their welfare. So, the challenge of understanding animals, today I'm going to talk about how we can do this in a better way. But let's start first with what is animal welfare actually? Because we need to know that first if we want to answer all these questions. So I like this model. There's many different definitions of welfare and there's not a single right one. But this model I really like. So this is what we call the 3 bubbles of welfare. So we can look at welfare from a biological function perspective. So this is the animal healthy? Can it move normally? For example, is the animal lame? It doesn't have very good functionality. Is it in pain? Any diseases, immune system that doesn't function properly, etc. We can also look at natural living, and here we talk about if the animal is able to express species-specific behaviors. So if we're talking about a social species, it's really important for this animal to be with other animals of the same species and to express these behaviors. Or animals that would normally spend a lot of time foraging for food. If we don't allow an animal to do that, this can lead to frustration and stress. And then finally, we have the affective state. So this relates to emotions and how the animal feels. While biological function and natural living, they're reasonably, I wouldn't say easy, but we can measure them quite accurately. Affective states is a real challenge because these are subjective. And they're probably not even the same for every animal. Even if I look at people here, I cannot know for sure what you are feeling and what you are thinking. So it's even more challenging to do this for an animal that's so different from ourselves. The good thing is, in many ways, animals are also similar to us. So we can use the parallels that we know are similar between people and animals, and we can use that to get some sort of understanding, but still trying to get into the perspective of the animal without putting human values and judgment on it. So I started this journey as a PhD student back in 2007, I think I started. And this was in New Zealand. And in New Zealand, there's a lot of sheep, as you may be aware of. And these sheep, they're kept in extensive pastures, extensive systems, so they're just grass-fed. And they're outside all year round. And like wild animals, they're quite well adapted to these fluctuations in food availability throughout the seasons. And so when there's more grass in the summer, they might put on weight and they might lose it again when there's less grass available. And that's, to some extent, is not really a problem. But what sometimes happens is that there are extremes in fluctuations of food intake. For example, when I was there, we had an extreme summer drought and there was no grass. And farmers are not prepared for this, so there's no hay, there's no concentrates. And then what happens? Well, farmers end up shooting their animals because they can't feed them. So obviously, starvation is the other alternative, which is not great. And there's a lot of skinny animals on the farm during these periods. And the question is, well, if these are the animals that we have in our care, we perhaps have the responsibility to make sure they don't go through these extreme periods of starvation. But then how do we know when is it too much? When is an animal too skinny? When is it too hungry? And how can we guarantee these animals' welfare? So that was the question that I had here. And then we were interested in body condition score, which is the measure of the amount of fat that a sheep has. It's scored from 0 to 5, so 0 is starving and 5 is fat. And then we wanted to know if we could use this condition score as an indication of their welfare in these extensive pastures systems. So how did we do that? So we had the problem, of course, which was food restriction. And then I was interested in the mental states of these animals. So what happens? This animal doesn't have enough food, it probably is hungry. Well, hungry has, of course, a strong physiological component. And we can measure this by, does my pointer work? Yeah, there. We can measure this by taking a blood sample and measure how much glucose they have as an indicator of the energy reserve, or other metabolic indicators. We can also look at some of the hormones that we know control food intake. And this can give us some idea of how much hunger the animal could be experiencing. Then, of course, we can look at body condition score, so that's the amount of fat that the animal has. But hunger also has a different aspect, which is how the animal perceives its own hunger state. And this is where it's really important for its welfare, because if the animal doesn't experience this as a problem, well, perhaps we don't need to worry about it. So that's the question I had here. And this perception of hunger we can measure by assessing feeding motivation. And together, all these measures we can integrate into one welfare aspect, where we integrate all these measures together to get some idea of how good the welfare is. So how do we do that? So what I wanted to know, what does the animal think of its own situation when it doesn't have enough food? And animals in many ways are different from us, but in other ways they're very similar to us. So like us, animals make economic decisions all day long. And that is because food intake is a function of the amount of effort or time to obtain that food. So economic decision making is really central to understanding how much animals eat. And what's interesting is that animals will eat a lot when food is free. So if you give an animal a bowl of food, they'll probably eat it, even if they're not hungry, because food is tasty. Animals like to eat like us. And this is, on the other hand, a different problem, because what we now see, for example, in our pets, that they become obese because they have a strong drive to eat. So if we just give a hungry sheep and a not hungry sheep a bowl of food, probably both these sheep will finish. The hungry sheep might eat a little bit more, but probably not that much. So this is not really a good way to assess how hungry sheep are. So what we need to do, we need to let sheep pay a price for access to food. So we can do this with a method called behavioral economics or behavioral demand. So how does this work? So just as an example here, if I give you this lovely bowl of Brussels sprouts, how much would you pay for this? Maybe not a lot. Maybe I have to pay you money to eat it. Yeah? How about this though? Would you pay for this? Maybe 50 crowns in a cafe, 60 even. But now imagine that you are starving, you haven't eaten in 3 days. Would you pay for this now? Maybe quite a lot if this was all you could get, right? So these kind of questions we can ask to the animal as well. Of course, we don't use money for people, but we use effort, which in our case was walking. So what did I do? I had a big group of sheep, and at the beginning they were all kind of healthy. So body condition score of 3, which is what you see in the middle here. So this is what we would consider an average sheep with a good level of body reserves, but not too fat. And then we put them on different diets. So we maintained a group of sheep on this diet, and then we fed a group of sheep restrictedly to make them go down to a condition score of 2, which is really quite skinny. So if you put your hand on this sheep, you will feel all its bones sticking out. We also had one group of sheep that we fed to increase condition score to 4. If you put your hands on this sheep, you don't feel any bones, so they're quite fat. And then we asked them if these animals were willing to pay for their food, and if so, how much were they willing to pay for food? So the assumption here is if an animal is willing to pay a high price for food, that it's more hungry and that food is more important. So it has a very strong motivation. So we used a motivation test. We put the sheep in a race. There's unfortunately no sound, but you can see. And this sheep goes to a feeder. There, when it gets there, it gets 5 grams of food. So it's just a tiny handful. It's not a lot. It gets 5 grams of food. Then once it's eaten that, the gate comes back. It will come back in a minute. Yeah, and it pushes the sheep out again. So we have this race, and the walking distance is the price that the sheep pays. So we have a very low price, which is 1 meter. So it's basically just turn around and come back. And then we have 5 other prices, and the highest price is 50 meters. So the sheep needs to go all the way 25 meters and then come back. And every time they get the same tiny amount of food. And the sheep are in here for 24 hours at each cost. So they cannot get the food outside. So they just have to pay for their food by walking. There's no other way they can get food. And then we see how much they are paying. So here we have what is called a demand curve, which has the number of rewards here and the cost in meters that the sheep have been paying. And the relation between the consumption of the food and its cost is described here by the demand curve. So we can see here that the condition score 2 animals, so the skinny ones, they consumed a lot more rewards compared to the condition score 3, so the medium animals, and the condition score 4, the really fat ones. And when we calculated the maximum price that they're willing to pay, so the low condition score animals, they were willing to pay 49 meters. And when they were walking in total, we also look at the maximum output, which is simply the maximum cost multiplied by the number of rewards they got. They walked 13 kilometers in this 24-hour period. So we also had videos in there. These sheep didn't stop walking. They just kept walking. They didn't rest, they didn't stop. They just wanted to eat. Then the medium condition score ones, so what we think are quite healthy animals. We also took blood samples, and these were metabolically quite balanced. But even they paid 35 meters for access to food. And at the output, the maximum output, they were willing to walk over 9 kilometers. So that is still quite a lot. But only when we looked at the fat sheep, they only paid 12 meters. And at the maximum output, they walked only about 1.5 kilometers. So there was not much difference between the low and the medium condition score animals, which suggests that even an animal that seems to have a reasonable amount of body reserve still willing to pay a high price for food. It's not until they actually get towards overweight that they're not willing to do that anymore. So we can also look at this in another way. So I've expressed here how much they ate at each cost, at each cost, as a percentage of the maintenance intake. And maintenance intake is the amount of food an animal needs to eat to maintain its current body weight. And at the highest, at all the higher cost, except the very highest, the low and medium animals, they eat above maintenance. And only when it really gets too expensive, they drop a little bit. But if we look at the fat animals, even at the lowest cost, they're not willing to eat as much as they normally would. And at the highest cost, it drops down to 10%. So these animals they're willing to starve for 24 hours. And if we looked at the videos, they just slept in their shelter all day long. So a very big difference here. And it's also interesting from this fat animals perspective, if you think of other species that we have an obesity problem with, just getting them to pay some more for food might be a really good way to reduce intake and to reduce weight. So of course, we also published this work in a number of different papers. I won't go into the detail of all of them, but you can look them up later, of course. And then this was at the end of my PhD. We've done a number of experiments. And then I decided to do a postdoc in Australia, again, working with sheep. But I got stuck with some more questions because it's really nice to look at feeding motivation and get some idea of how hungry they are, what's a healthy level of body fat that animals need to have. But it doesn't really tell us how the animal actually feels. Because it doesn't tell us if the animal's actually feeling good or if the animal's feeling bad. So I got stuck with that question. So I wanted to know, does hunger actually influence how the animal feels? And here we're really talking about emotion. So does being hungry actually make the animal feel bad? And so here we are starting to talk about emotions and affective states. So what are affective states? Affective states consist of emotions which are very intense but short-lived valence states. So valence means it's positive or negative. It's not neutral. And they are induced by an event or an object. And most, they are longer and more free-floating states. They are also valence, so not neutral, but they are not necessarily associated with a specific event or object. So how can we actually measure this? Because we cannot go out to the animal and just ask, well, how do you feel? So we need to come up with clever ways to get some indication. And we know from decades of human research that there is a bidirectional link between cognitive processes, which is the thinking processes, so how animals get information from the environment, how they process and store it and act on it, and the affective state. So these are really two sides of the same coin. They are linked. So how does this work? So for example, if the animal gets scared, let's say there's something moving in the bushes next to the animal, and the animal perceives a potential threat, which then leads to the emotion of fear. But it also works the other way around. So for example, an individual that's quite anxious, either because they've been living in an environment that makes them anxious, chronic stress, etc., or because they have an anxious personality trait. These individuals, they tend to be on constant alert for things happening around them. So they have an increased attention to threatening stimuli. They might also interpret ambiguous things, so things that are not clearly good and bad, but they might interpret them as more negative when they're feeling anxious. So we cannot measure the affective states directly because we cannot ask, but what we can easily measure is these cognitive processes. So what I wanted to do was to use a cognitive test to get some indication of the affective state. So as an example here, imagine you are very, very thirsty. And now I'm going to give you a full glass of water. You will probably experience this as something positive because you're thirsty. But then I actually bring you an empty glass of water. So now you're going to be disappointed. You experience it as negative. But what if I gave you a glass that was half filled? How would you feel about that? So if you are what we call a pessimist, you would think that the glass here is half empty. But if you were an optimist, you would think that it is half full. And we know from people that when they are feeling bad in a negative emotional state, they are more likely to interpret this kind of ambiguous information as negative, as pessimistic. So I wanted to measure this in hungry sheep. So how do we do that? We're not using glasses of water, but we can do this in an arena. So this test is called judgment bias, and we have sheep that this is our test sheep here, and we train the sheep to go into one location here, and when it does, it gets rewarded by another sheep that's sitting on the other side of the door. So that looks like this. So the sheep comes in here, it goes to the corner, we lift the door, and there's another sheep at the other side. So sheep generally learn this very, very quickly. They like to go to other sheep. And then after a while, when the sheep has had enough, it can go out again. And then we have another set of training, which we call the negative training. So now we have the opposite end of the arena open. But when the sheep goes there, we also lift the door, but now there's a dog behind it. And the dog is a predator, and these are Australian sheep that are herded with dogs. They really don't like dogs. So this teaches the sheep very quickly, if this location is open, don't go there. You get the dog, you get punished by the dog. So what that looks like, so the sheep is now coming in at the other side, or the other side is open, but it's already learned that there's a dog. So it wants to go back to the positive side. There's no sound, but it's bleating a lot. It's really unhappy about this situation. And then we wait for 30 seconds. And if it doesn't go there, we take it out. So this is what we call a go, no-go task. So go if you want to be rewarded by the sheep. Don't go if you don't want to be punished by the dog. And then we have the locations that are somewhere in between. So these are our ambiguous locations. So we have the glass glass full, glass empty, and somewhere in between. Now, what does the sheep choose? And if they choose to decide to approach these locations somewhere in between, we assume that it was expecting to be rewarded by the sheep. So this is what we call optimistic response. But if the sheep does not approach, then we assume that it was expecting to be punished by the dog. So this is a pessimistic response. So then we had two groups of sheep. One group of sheep we restricted for 1 week as 70% of their normal food intake, so they were a little bit hungry. And we had another group of sheep, and they got to eat as much as they liked for 1 week. So we had this high food group, the red, and the low food group, the blue. And then we tested them in this judgment bias test. So we have the proportion of sheep approaching. So a 1 means that all sheep approach that location. So at the positive location where the sheep was, almost all of them approached, which was what you would expect. And at the negative location, which is where the dog was, most sheep did not approach. And then we have the in-between locations, the ambiguous one. So what we see is that there's no difference between the high and low food at the positive location. But when we get towards the negative location and the near negative location, then the low food group sheep were actually more likely to approach. So we would normally interpret that as an optimistic response. But of course, I don't think it's hard to think that being hungry would make sheep more optimistic. It could be, of course. But what we think actually happened, we know from a lot of other studies that when animals get hungry, they start to explore more because they're looking for food. And they also start to take more risk because they need food. Food is essential to survive. So if they don't have enough, they get more risk takers because they need to get their food. And I think that's potentially what we have measured here. So this, I did a postdoc in Australia for several years, and there were a lot of other studies around this topic. And then in 2014, I moved to Sweden, but I still had many, many more questions. So what I've been doing in Sweden, among other things, is that I wanted to look at different aspects of the affective states, because judgment bias now is the gold standard of measuring affective states, but it's only one test. And I think we run the risk, if we only apply one test for all our questions about affective states, that we miss out on some answers, because affective states are incredibly complex. So I wanted to see if there were potentially other tests that we could develop and validate that could measure different aspects and so make the picture more complete. So I went back to the drawing board and I looked into the human psychology studies and see if there was anything useful there. And I found one test which is called Attentional scope. So this is another cognitive test of emotion. And here what we're looking at if the animal can see the forest for the trees. So this is about broadening and narrowing of attention. So in people, it's been shown, for example, when people are very wanting to get something positive, for example, a dessert, then they become very narrowly focused. So they focus on the trees, on the details. They get this tunnel vision. And they just want to do everything to get what they want and they ignore the rest. So also when it's about money, when I ask people to play a gambling game in the lab and they can win money, they become super focused. So they focus on the trees. On the other hand, if they lose whatever they wanted to have, so they lose the betting game and they didn't get the money, their attention becomes much more broad. So they can see the forest. So they look at more things around them, possibly because that helps them to locate where the next good thing is going to come from. So what I wanted to do is validate this test also for animals and see if we could measure similar things. So I wanted to use something very clear that we know is positive. And here this study was in dogs. And I know dogs love sausages. If you have a dog, you probably know that dogs love sausages. So we used sausages and we used taking away sausages as something negative. And then we applied this test. So what we found here, so we had in our test, we had different stimuli. They were visual stimuli, so they were smaller shapes that were organized together in a larger shape. So the smaller shapes we call the trees, and the big, large shape we call the forest. And then after this, we can then ask the animal if they've been focusing on the trees or if they've been focusing on the forest. So it's not, of course, we're not showing them pictures of trees or forests, it's different pictures, but that's the analog, so to help you understand what we were doing. And then we first gave the animals sausages and asked them if they saw the trees or if they saw the forest. And then we took the sausage away, of course, in random order. And we asked the same question. So dogs could always choose, do I see the trees or do I see the forest? So here we have the proportion of dogs that said they saw the trees. And here on this line here. And then we had the negative treatment and the positive treatment here. And we repeated each experiment twice. And in the first round, we didn't actually see any differences. They were about 50-50. So the line here, you see it's a 50-50 choice, so there's no preference. And we have some reasons why we think this happened. But when we repeated it the second time, we actually saw a very big difference. So now we saw the dogs, after they had the sausages, about 85% of them chose the trees. So it seemed that, like in people, giving dogs something they really, really want also makes them have this tunnel vision, this really high focus. But the negative one, where we took away the sausage, it didn't seem to be so different from a 50-50 choice. But anyway, it's a promising first result, but of course it's only one particular emotional state and we have to validate it for different emotional states and also for longer term mood states. It would be nice to look at that as well. But it's a nice beginning. So then I have another project and we've been talking a lot about how we can use food or not having food and look at different affective states in animals. But all this food at some point gets digested also. And this digestion, well, it changes the animal's physiology, of course, but it does a lot more than that. Because in the animal's tummy, there's a lot of microbes living there. And these microbes, they help with the digestive process, of course, but it's a lot more than just getting nutrients and energy and etc. These microbes actually have an active role in communicating with the brain, and they can change the animal's behavior. So we asked some more questions about how these gut microbes could potentially influence affective states. So in the old view of looking at the brain and behavior, then what we thought what happened is that there's all kinds of things coming from the outside, external stimuli, and also internal stimuli, for example, hormones, neurotransmitters, etc. They get integrated into the brain, and these influence behavior and cognition and the mood of the animal and the animal's physiology. But now we have a new view, because it turns out it was a little bit more complicated than that, because there is communication between the brain and also the gut. And now the gut sometimes even is called the second brain. So the picture here is a little bit more complex. So we have a direct communication path between the brain and the gut, and it goes both ways. And we still have the indirect communication as well. So the gut and the brain indirectly communicate through, example, the immune system, through the stress system, through hormones, through neurotransmitters, etc. And together, they influence behavior, cognition, emotion, and also the animal's physiology. And how the gut and the brain communicate with each other is also influenced by the microbes. So I was interested in investigating this in relation to the affective state, and I used a third cognitive test of affective state, which is called attention bias to threat. I have been developing and refining this test over the last 10 years, so we already validated in sheep, also in hunger and in stress. So now I wanted to look at it in this perspective. So what is an attention bias to threat? It's an increased tendency to direct attention towards threatening stimuli in anxious individuals. And of course, this again comes originally from humans, but we're doing a lot of work on validating it in animals as well. So it's again giving a different perspective of the affective state. So if we have more tests, we can every time pick up a different piece of the puzzle and get a more overall view of the animal's affective states. Plus the advantage of attention bias, it doesn't take as much time and training as the other two tests. They take an awful weeks and weeks of training the animals to learn, and this we don't need to do that. So that makes it more suitable, for example, for very young animals, or even if we wanted to do it in more animals. So how does this work? So attention bias, really it looks at how the animal responds to a threat in the environment. And in people we know that when somebody is anxious for whatever reason, they're very quickly to detect a threat. But after that initial quick detection, very often they will then start to avoid the threat because it's too strong for people. So they will avoid looking at it, they will avoid going to it. And this is called the vigilance avoidance hypothesis. And they do this simply to regulate their own emotional state and to stay in control. So we wanted to see if the same happened in piglets if we gave them probiotics to change the gut microbiota. So we gave probiotics, which is a beneficial bacteria. And then we gave this already really early on. And unfortunately, you don't hear the sound. But there's a dog barking now, which is the threat. Can play it again. Yeah. So there's... Oh, can we play it again? So the pig is just walking around, and then you'll see it freeze in a moment. That's when you would hear a dog sound. That's the threat. And then we look at the behavior of the pig after the threat. So is this pig, is it paying attention to the sound? What is it doing? Is it looking away, or is it looking towards? Or is it going perhaps with the other piglets? We also look at its vigilance behavior. So an animal that's scared, that's looking out for threats, has its head up because it can look around and be prepared. One animal that's relaxed, put its head down and not be so vigilant. So what we found here in this study is that when we gave the animals these probiotics, which we hope would change its affective state for the better, what we found here is that before the threat, both the control, which is the light blue, and the probiotic treated group, they were equally vigilant. But after the threat, we saw a very big increase in vigilance behavior in the control group, but not in the probiotics group. So they didn't become more vigilant. They didn't seem to be more alert for threats afterwards. And if we looked at the attention, there was a tiny difference already before, but the difference became even bigger after the threat. And the probiotics group actually looked a lot more at the threat. So what we think happened is that this looking at the threat gave them the opportunity to see, well, there's actually nothing there. There's nothing real. There's nothing scary. So they just went back to doing what they were doing before, which was just sniffing and exploring what pigs normally do. But the control group, they didn't look. And then even after the sow disappeared, they stayed quite on alert because they were not sure if something was actually going to happen or not. So this is very much in line with the vigilance avoidance hypothesis that's also consistently be found in people. So very last slide is the future of affective state research. So where do I think this area should go to? Well, I think we have to focus on longer term moods and especially how these longer term moods are created in animals. Because we have very little understanding what animals perceive and how these longer moods, how they change over time and what influences them. And especially if we want to help animals not just in the moment but over a longer period of time, we have to get better measures of these as well. So we have to get better measures that can be behavioral, cognitive or physiology measures to assess moods in different environments. And potentially we could even use AI to do this. We also need to make sure that we can guarantee a life worth living to all animals, even for farm animals that are living in quite confined and restricted environment. So what we need to do here, of course, we've had decades of research showing that stress and pain and etc., all that is bad and we want to avoid it. But we also know now that that is not enough to really guarantee a life worth living. We also need to give the animals the possibility to experience positive emotions. And this is what I would like to do in the future. And for example, give animals more agency and the freedom of choice to choose the activities that they find rewarding for its own sake. Like we would choose to go to the cinema, not just because it helps us survive, but because it simply makes us feel good. And I think we should look if animals can experience what animals need to experience those states. So, thank you very much, and let's improve animal welfare together.